and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. South Korean President Moon Jae-in will travel to Washington for a summit with President Trump. In this time of lull in diplomacy with North Korea, will the two leaders be able to find a breakthrough?
He wasn't ready. I told him, you're not ready for a deal. That's the first time anybody has ever told him that.
In the studio with me today, Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. She served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador, let me begin with you. President Trump called President Moon right after the Hanoi summit on his way to Washington on Air Force One. And President Moon then asked President Trump to meet in person and have in-depth discussions. And now the two leaders are having that summit soon. So what does President Moon want from this meeting, and why is he coming to Washington?
Well, I think first and foremost, President Moon is coming to Washington because he and President have set up a pattern of meeting pretty often. I think this is their 7th meeting since each came to office, and they're allies. And this process, in fact, has been a very summit-oriented process, so I think it's not surprising that maybe the pace of summitry, and I actually would welcome it between Seoul and Washington as allies, is also pretty vigorous. But in this case, I think in particular, obviously, with the Hanoi results being disappointing, surprising, incomplete, somewhat worrying, I think. We could talk about the range of reactions, and I'm sure you have with your listeners. I think it was important that President Trump immediately consult with President Moon, I mean, the country most affected, in addition to the United States, by the outcome, and talk about where to go next. I think what's also important to note, just in terms of a diplomatic process, is that it has been, a bit of time since Hanoi, and in that time, there's been a pretty vigorous exchange of views, I think mostly in private, but meetings between senior South Korean and senior American Trump administration officials to talk about what happened and the way forward. So in a way, this preparation, I think, for this meeting in Washington between President Moon and President Trump is the kind of preparation I wish we'd see a little bit more maybe with North Korea. But I think clearly one of the prime things on the agenda, and of course there'll be other things too, we have a big alliance with things like trade and burden sharing and other things, but will be post-Hanoi and where do we go from here? And I'm sure that President Moon wants to keep open the hope that, as I think President Trump said he did, that there is some way forward.
Mr. Snyder, what do you think President Moon specifically is aiming for in this meeting?
I think President Moon's main objective is to try to keep open the pathway to peaceful denuclearization that he was able to open for the first time following the Pyeongchang Olympics. Now he sees there's some rocks and stones in the road. He's worried that there might be some kind of avalanche that could block that roadway. And so he really wants to keep that pathway open. I think he also wants to show that he can be helpful in facilitating some kind of closing of the gap between the United States and North Korea. And I think he's right to come to Washington first before publicly reaching out to North Korea. I think in the media there's been the suggestion that maybe at some point there would be a special envoy from South Korea to the north. But that envoy can do his job better if it is framed by a solid conversation between Moon and Trump about what the U.S. wants and expects from North Korea. And then if South Korea can find a way to illuminate North Korea's understanding on these issues and share information, then that's a useful role for South Korea to play, and it is a way for President Moon to show that he is still supporting keeping that pathway to peaceful denuclearization an open pathway.
But the fact that South Korea didn't have any high-level contact with North Korea before having this summit, how does that make South Korea have anything new to bring to the table to come up with any new solution to suggest to President Trump?
Well, I think that South Korea clearly has its own ideas and has watched the process. I wouldn't be surprised if the South Koreans have a read on what North Korea is thinking right now. But really the other piece that we need to see that I think has not yet been fully shown is what does North Korea want? And it'll be interesting to see whether North Korea unveils what it wants in the context of their own Supreme People's Assembly meetings that'll be occurring almost concurrently with the US-ROK summit, or whether we get a better view of what North Korea wants actually following the US-South Korea summit, in which case we have an opportunity to shape the initial message, and North Korea would be responding to that message.
So, if I could just add, I mean, I also think it's important and appropriate for President Moon to hear personally from President Trump what he's thinking now, before he begins to take the next steps to shape South Korean policy and how they work together. It's one thing to have a phone conversation, but now President Trump has had a few weeks to reflect as well, and this is an administration that doesn't always speak with one voice. That's not unique to the Trump administration, but it's just particularly dramatic sometimes, and where President Trump himself has some, feels very personally invested in this. So I get a sense of, if you like, greater comfort out of the notion that President Moon's going to hear directly from President Trump before he tries to engage in a really much more serious way with Pyongyang in whatever form that takes.
So there's this clear gap between Washington and Pyongyang. Washington wants big deal and Pyongyang wants incremental deals. Do you think the U.S. and Seoul will be able to come up with some kind of solution to closing this gap?
Well, I actually think the biggest gap is that what North Korea put on the table in Hanoi was a pathway to what I would call incomplete denuclearization. And what the United States wants to see is complete denuclearization. And so that is the first gap that I think has to be closed between Washington and Pyongyang, and it is a sizable one. But I think there's also a gap about expectations on process. And there, it seems like the U.S. at Hanoi, but not necessarily prior to Hanoi, went with a kind of all or nothing approach, wanting to eat the pie in one bite. But realistically, if you eat the pie in one bite, you might get indigestion. So maybe a process, several bites of the pie would be necessary in order to be able to effectively address this issue. So there are actually two issues that I think are really significant issues and gaps. And I think that South Korea can help to provide North Korea with understanding about U.S. expectations, and then perhaps share the North Korean response with the United States through a kind of facilitation process.
South Korean official says the recent meeting between Secretary Pompeo and South Korean Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa, they discussed actually tours to Mount Kumgang and Kaesong Industrial Complex in a broad sense. So do you think President Moon may also bring this issue up during the summit with President Trump?
I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And of course, this has been something that's been on the table for quite a long time. And I believe that Kim Jong-un also raised his interest, if you like, in seeing Mount Kumgang and the Kaesong Industrial Park reopened some months ago. So in a way, I think one of the surprises, if you like, of sort of what didn't happen in Hanoi is that either there wasn't much interest on the part of North Korea in seeing that, or there was just no readiness on the part of the U.S. because of the emphasis on having the all-or-nothing deal in looking at that. So to me, it's still a little bit of a puzzle as to where that actually fits both into the North Korean priorities and the South Korean. But I think if you were going to look at, as a diplomat, as a negotiator, if you're going to look at some of the early harvest harvest. That's one word that's been used again, of things that could be done. Some kind of inter-Korean step, such as those reopenings, if it came with a bit of learning lessons from the past, finding a way to reopen them while managing and controlling the funds that are paid to the workers there in a way that provides more assurance that that money will not be diverted to other uses, of finding a way to have the kind of carve-out that maintains the important sanctions until there is full denuclearization, but allows this kind of activity. I would think that that would be an area that President Moon would certainly, consider exploring, depending on what he hears from President Trump. But I imagine he'll be in a listening mode, but also ready to put a few things on the table, and maybe there will be a little bit more receptivity to that this time around.
If I could just add to that, President Moon may raise the issue with Trump, but I think that the solution to that problem set lies more in Pyongyang than in Washington. Because at Hanoi, what we saw is the North Koreans going for sanctions removal, not sanctions exemption. And so in order for Kumgang and Kaesong to even be on the table, I think the North Koreans have to adjust their position to one that would accept the idea of exemptions rather than going for a much more ambitious objective of sanctions removal.
And Ambassador Stephens, to President Trump, personal relationships are really important. So what do you think of the chemistry between President Trump and President Moon?
I think President Moon has worked very hard at the relationship. I think he's done, if I say, quite well at trying to understand and accommodate President Trump's own great interest in Korea, which I think I get the sense that he genuinely, as many Korean people do, the fact that he really has taken this on as a priority.
The breakdown of the Hanoi summit raised criticism that President Moon oversold North Korea's intentions to denuclearize. So what are the limits of President Moon's shuttle diplomacy, shuttling between Washington and Pyongyang?
I think the limit of the shuttle diplomacy lies with the fact that the U.S. and North Korea now have a relationship with each other. And so, in my view, that really almost removes the risk that President Moon should be accused of overselling any information about North Korean intentions, because it's our job, it's the job of U.S. senior diplomats to go to the source, go to the North Korean side, and confirm what their intent is. And obviously we have a kind of mixed verdict from Hanoi in terms of how the U.S. is processing Kim Jong-un's intent. And I do think that it is worthy of additional conversation on the U.S. side with North Korea. But again, what South Korea can offer there is a better cultural understanding of some aspects of what Kim Jong-un might be thinking that the U.S. might not yet fully see. And that really comes from the fact that when Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un meet, for one, they don't have interpreters. They can speak in the same language. And I think that's a tremendous advantage in terms of understanding the mood and the intent around the conversation. At the same time, Kim Jong-un, in the end, is going to have to show his cards. If he really wants to pursue denuclearization, he's going to have to show his cards to the United States, and the United States is going to have to reciprocate.
And Mr. Snyder, there are concerns currently that there's a fissure between Washington and Seoul. Do you agree? And if this is the case, how can the two sides mend relationship?
Well, we've had a very intense period of high-level consultation right now with the foreign ministers meeting, with the defense ministers meeting, with preparations for the summit. And we're highly institutionalized. And so I think that the U.S. and South Korean sides understand each other very well. It doesn't mean that there's always agreement, but I do think that there is sufficient understanding. Actually, as an alliance, it means that ultimately both sides are going to have to proceed in a unified fashion in order to make progress. And so I actually feel like we're not really in such bad shape right at this particular moment. And that whatever proceeds from the Moon-Trump meeting is likely to be as a result of a common understanding of where the agreement is and also where the guardrails are beyond which it's impossible to find agreement.
We'll end our conversation here and watch video for our next discussion.
자유조선을 위한 그룹 정치도 있는 이 임시정부는 인권과 인도주의를 존중하는 국가를 건설하기 위한
들어갑니다.
Days before the Hanoi summit, a break-in occurred at North Korea's embassy in Madrid after a Spanish court accused an American, Mexican, and South Korean of the attack. A group called Free Joseon claimed responsibility. South Korea's National Intelligence Service also confirmed the existence of this group, saying that they are a network organization. Now, Mr. Snyder, North Korea belatedly called this a terrorist attack, and there are reports that the group actually shared information with the FBI. So do you think North Korea may use this raid case to pressure Washington in some way if the denuclearization talks don't go well?
I can imagine that North Korea might try, but I don't think that there is a basis upon which to credibly make a charge of U.S. government involvement in this action by a newly emerging non-governmental organization network on a North Korean property. It's really going to be, I think, primarily the responsibility of the government of Spain to try to sort through a lot of that. But in terms of the relationship with the U.S. government, even if information fell into the hands of the FBI in some form, there's really no evidence that the U.S. government or intelligence agencies pursued this or would have pursued this type of action in this way. So I don't think that an effort on the North Korean part to raise this issue would be seen as credible on the U.S. side.
And Ambassador Stephens, so the attack at the embassy happened in broad daylight, and the group also warned to Chairman Kim that unless he stops the forced repatriation of the defectors and closes down the political prison camps, Chairman Kim will face more embarrassment. So these provocative actions and words, do these cause any concerns?
Well, I mean, I have to say, as someone who was in diplomatic missions for many years, I think it is a challenge for the international community if embassies and well, we saw it in Turkey as well, if diplomatic residences and facilities are not protected. We have a shared interest in that. And I agree with Scott's comments about I just don't see the hand of the U.S. in this. To me, the kind of interesting point about this is, are we, and it really is a question I don't have the answer to, but I think we should watch for, are we at a point where, I mean, because of some of the changes that have taken place within North Korea in the external environment, of a slight opening of more North Koreans leaving, defecting, being elsewhere as refugees, the growing kind of international activity around issues like human rights, whether or not there will develop a bit of a expatriate, if you like, or defector community that does try to present itself as an alternative power. Obviously, we've seen that in other countries under authoritarian or totalitarian rule. We have not seen it in the case of the DPRK over the years, and it's kind of an interesting question of whether or not that will develop. But I do think in terms of, and I don't speak obviously for any government, in terms of attacking embassies, and certainly North Korean embassies have not always been bastions of all the right practices, but nonetheless that crosses a line which creates some concern, notwithstanding the fact that I obviously share a lot of the concerns that are raised by with respect to human rights, for example, in North Korea.
And Mr. Snyder, the defectors told the VOA that they support Free Joseon and that they seem like independence movement during the Japanese colonial rule. So would the actions like Free Joseon, would that pressure Pyongyang regime in any way?
Well, I can understand the sentiment that the defectors are expressing, and I do think that this is a new type of organization using different tactics than we have seen before. And I think that one of the most interesting aspects of the tactics that are being used is that they are really playing on the possibility of paranoia at the leadership level in North Korea, especially about whether this organization can have reach into North Korea in ways that would actually challenge leadership. And so that's really, we haven't seen it before. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. But at the same time, you know, this is a new organization, and in my view, the other thing that they haven't yet done is to fully establish themselves as a defector organization with broad support in that North Korean diaspora community at this point. And so I think that if they can gather that support, then it could really gain a kind of momentum that we haven't seen before, but at present I don't yet see that support as comprehensively in place to support the activities.
So, so far, have you seen that unified voice from the defector community?
I feel like there's still more work to be done in that area. I know that there have been efforts of other sorts to try to unify the defector community, but it's actually a very hard community to unify because the defectors bring with them their experience in North Korea, and in particular, the stratification of status that existed in North Korea ends up playing itself out here. And so as a result, it means that it's very difficult for defectors with different types of family backgrounds, institutional relationships with the North Korean government previously, to actually work together with each other because they come from a background of having been so deeply divided by North Korea's own internal classification system.
And Ambassador, do you expect more groups like this springing up and more dissident movement unless North Korea changes and improve its human rights record?
Well, you know, I don't know. I mean, if the, and I think Scott is actually right to call it, and I've never used that term before, the North Korean diaspora community, that is actually something that, again, didn't really exist in the same numbers by any means, or really at all, a couple of decades ago, even a decade ago. So I think it's an important thing to watch, but given the kind of divisions, and I've seen it too in the defector community I've met, mostly in South Korea, of course, or almost exclusively in South Korea, it hasn't coalesced yet, but it's growing, and I think it's something to watch.
Well, we'll end our conversation here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a picture of the Vietnamese woman charged in the death of Kim Jong-nam, half-brother to Chairman Kim Jong-un. This picture is taken as she comes out of a court in Malaysia after she was sentenced to a lesser charge of causing bodily harm. Another suspect was freed a month ago. South China Morning Post reports these women may be targeted by North Korean agents as they witnessed the assassination. Mr. Snyder?
Well, this means that there is no individual that is being held accountable for Kim Jong-nam's death. At the same time, this woman and the other woman were pawns in an assassination attempt. And so I think that the judgment is correct, but there's still more work to be done in terms of bringing perpetrators to justice for a brazen assassination of Kim Jong-nam.
Ambassador.
Well, I endorse, I agree with what Scott had to say about this. I mean, clearly both these women were pawns. It is kind of heartbreaking to see this photograph, but it also is a reminder of what a grotesque and blatant act of chemical warfare, terrorism, whatever you want, was conducted in an international airport, the kind of place we all walk around all the time. And you know, we become a little bit inured to these things somehow, or they almost become the subject of a joke because they're so outrageous. But I think this does remind me of the human cost and the continuing threat that there is. And the fact that, as Scott said, no one has really been held accountable for this.
On that note, Ambassador Stephens and Mr. Snyder, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.